to Book Reporter Talks To. Our guest today is Sarah Ruhl, the author of the memoir, Smile, The Story of a Face. Sarah is a playwright whose work includes In the Next Room, or the Vibrator play, and The Clean House. She's been a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, a Tony Award nominee, and the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. Joining me today on our interview is Austin Ruhl, who steps from behind the camera to join us today in his, instead of his usual producer role for Book Reporter Talks To. He's read many of Sarah's plays, and thus I wanted him to have the opportunity to speak with her as well. So welcome to both Sarah and Austin.
And do we sort of have the same last name? I'm just throwing that out there, Austin.
My last name is Ruhl.
So you just need an L. If you had an
I
L,
just throw the L on there and
yeah.
There you go. There's
a link.
Some synergy going on here.
Okay. Thank you both for having me.
Oh, so looking forward to this. Sarah, let's start by you telling us about the book.
Yeah. So Smile is sort of a metaphysical and medical odyssey that begins when I had twins a decade ago, and it was a high-risk pregnancy. And the twins were miraculously born. And then I developed Bell's palsy, which is the paralysis of the seventh cranial nerve. So in my case, it paralyzed this side of my face. And for most people, Bell's palsy goes away quickly within 3 months. And I was in this minority of really slow boat, chronic, slow recovery or recoverers. And the book investigates what it's like to not be able to smile when you desperately want to smile, and what the relationship is between an inner landscape when the outer landscape doesn't match.
Mm-hmm. So what drew you to do the story now? I know it's taken a long time to be writing this. What was that catalyst of I really want to tell this?
Part of me didn't want to tell it at all. Part of me wanted to keep this very quiet and private. And my husband's a psychiatrist and he's very insightful. And at a point he said, you usually write about things that you think about a lot or that give you great pain. Speaking of, I think I just heard him doing psychiatry in the next room. That's pretty funny because my play's called In the Next Room. I wonder if his door is shut. Anyway, he said, so why aren't you writing about Bell's palsy? You think about it, it upsets you, you've suffered with it. And I thought, well, it's not a subject for a play. It's so interior. But I did think, well, maybe it's a book.
In your story.
And I was thinking, what about the writing process for Smile was different than something like a play or poetry?
Mm-hmm. Long form prose, for me, in this case, it was like unpeeling an onion. I mean, I knew I wanted to get to the core, but it was sort of like peeling, unpeeling, layer after layer. Whereas, writing a poem is just, it comes to me whole cloth usually. Like I just kind of receive most of it. And so there's that satisfaction of it being done rather quickly. And then a play comes to me in a really intense burst so that I could write the first act in a month and then maybe take time off and write the second act and then slowly revise. But I think because plays move through time for an audience, you kind of want to write it rather quickly. And the book did come out faster than I thought. It turned out I had a lot to say, but it was maybe a more meditative process.
Was there anything that seemed like unexpectedly the same as far as the process goes between those two types of things?
All writing is one for me, ultimately. I write in a lot of different genres. I write poetry and essays and plays and the occasional screenplay. And it all feels like a way of making sense of one's life through art. So in that sense, there were no real surprises. It surprised me how much I needed to write it, how much catharsis it gave me, healing it gave me to write the book. I didn't know that starting out.
I feel like also writing it as a memoir instead of nonfiction. I mean, you just could have written this as a nonfiction story of this is the story of Bell's palsy.
Right.
Writing the memoir, I think, gave you the opportunity to sort of unleash what was inside because you're writing to the page. You're writing you're thinking of the reader, but you're also just getting it out there of what's going on. Am I on the right track with that?
Definitely. I mean, it's a kind of, it's kind of transmorgified vomit, you know, in that sense, vomiting up something you really need to get out. And maybe I mentioned vomit because in the book, I talk about the 3 different ways my children vomit and how that characterizes each of their temperaments. So
That was so great.
That's great.
so it's like, I've got the dramatic vomiter, I've got the very efficient vomiter, I've got the kind of pitiful vomiter. Someone told me recently they have an apologetic vomiter, and I was like, ooh, that sounds good.
Wow. I wonder what that looks like. So, I mean, speaking of vomit, you mentioned how you wonder why medical stories like this don't really factor into the canon of storytelling the way that things like death and love do. So why is it that you think that this type of medical thing isn't really brought up the same way? People don't tell these stories.
Such a good question. I think that we don't know what to do with the chronic. It's a plot we don't know how to assimilate into our culture. You know, with death, there's an ending. With love, there's a beginning. But with chronic illness, there's sort of a slow unfolding. And I think we are getting more of that story, but it's a little bit invisible. It's a little bit walled off inside of hospitals, inside people's private apartments. And I think people historically have been scared of showing that vulnerability of their body. And I think when you're someone who is interested in the life of the mind, say, it can be also incredibly vulnerable or embarrassing to even admit that you have a body at all.
I think there was a lot of times too that people think that it's viewed as something wrong, like you did something wrong. And a lot of times it's if you fell, you tripped, this, you did this. And I think a lot of times we just have to, I mean, even people have been said like they've gotten cancer, and it's like, how did that happen? It's always like, how did it happen? It's not like, and especially something with nerve damage. It's unless you're like, you know, we're really good in science class, which I wasn't, you don't even really understand like how all this works. Like they basically have to draw, this is what you're going to do. And then to explain to people nerve regeneration takes a really long time. People are like, why not? Just go in there. And that's what I feel too. It's a lack of knowledge.
Definitely a lack of knowledge. And the shame and the fault is fascinating. Why do patients feel that illness is their fault? My mother, who had Bell's palsy also, but hers recovered much more quickly, said when she went to the doctor for Bell's palsy, she said, "Is it my fault because I'm fat?" And he kind of gasped and said, "Why would you ever think that?" No. But she's so used to doctors blaming her, you know, for having diabetes or, you know, what have you, that she comes to a doctor thinking about self-blame.
Yeah. Also, at the beginning of the book, you talk about being in the NICU unit with the twins and trying to convey ideas to the nurses. You realize that lacking these facial effects is challenging, as we usually portray a lot of what we're thinking in our faces. But is this something that you had to remind yourself of again and again? Like, they don't see what I'm saying. Like, they're not completely doing that. Was that something that you really challenged yourself with along the way?
It was excruciating because I wanted to be friendly. I wanted to show appreciation to the nurses, and I felt like I couldn't do it with my whole face. So I do think other senses kind of take over. So I would try to be more friendly with my voice, or I would try to gesture more to show that I understood or that I was animated. But I think having that kind of flattened out canvas was really hard for me. And I think ultimately for a long time gave me a bit of a flattened out inner life because I couldn't express what was going on with my face.
Yeah, you have to get very exuberant with your voice. I'm really happy in this moment right now. You just
nice to meet you.
What were some of the techniques that you used to get people to like understand your expression?
Well, it's not unlike what people do with masks now, do you know? So if you see a neighbor from far away in your mask, you probably give a little wave, right? Because you can't smile at them. So I would give a little wave, or I would murmur more to show that I understood. I would be like, like, you know, if someone was telling a long story, normally you'd mirror their facial expressions. And if I couldn't, I'd be like, So I tried to make more active listening noises. And then sometimes I would just have to be direct, like with my students at Yale School of Drama, where I teach. I would just say, if I don't look like I'm approving of your play when it's being read, if I look opaque, it's because I have this condition, my nerves are paralyzed, and I'm really enjoying it. Just because I didn't want them to feel in any way that I was being withholding.
And that's so important for writers, especially to feel like if somebody isn't responding the right way, it can really eat at you.
Oh my God. And I've been there on the other side of it. So yes.
I was nodding once in a while. People don't realize, I think, that the effects of Boyles palsy, in fact, until I read this book, are more than just the physical of what people see. And I really definitely love the fact that when the children were crying, it was more amplified to you. Can you share a little bit of what happens? Because people are just saying, oh, we see a droopy face, but they're not realizing there's a lot of other things going on with the nerve.
Yeah. I mean, the good thing is it's not like a stroke. So in that sense, you don't have, the brain isn't involved in that way. But the cranial nerve is a tiny nerve, but it's responsible for a lot of other things. So it's responsible for muffling noises. So yeah, loud noises were really excruciating. I had a terrible headache. That's at the very early acute phase. And after the acute phase passes, that stuff goes away. And really, for me, at least the most pronounced symptom was not being able to smile or not being able to blink. It took me about 6 months to blink again. So some people have to have surgery to weight their eye down so that they can close their eye. And I was lucky because I got back my wonderful ability to blink, which is something we take for granted.
Well, if not, it's like you're winking all the time. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
look at this woman. She's just doing this to me all
Well,
day.
yeah. That can happen too.
You mentioned how how it can be unhealthy to view illness as a metaphor. And so how did that change in language, especially because you're interested in language and words? How did that change the way that you approached Bell's palsy?
I think that it didn't occur to me until writing the book that maybe the metaphors I was using to think about my face were not serving me, were not helpful. I think at a point I would think, well, maybe my smile won't get better until I'm truly happy, again, which has a kind of self-blame. Or I would think, in fairy tale logic, you trade something to get something you really desire. So I really wanted my babies to be born healthy because I had a pretty crazy condition called cholestasis of the liver when I was pregnant, which has bile leaking into your bloodstream and it can kill the babies. So when they were born healthy, that felt like a miracle. And I thought, well, I have to trade something for that. And that was my face. And at a point, I think those metaphors were not helpful, actually. I don't think they served me. So I think writing the book was also a process of shedding some bizarre metaphors that I had been clinging to.
You also learned that you had celiac disease, something that might have been missed if it wasn't for Bell's palsy. And what was it like when that light bulb went off of, wait a second, we're connecting all these things together, which you realize you need really good medical people talking to you as well to be making those connections. And often they're lacking. Often that's not happening.
Well, in my case, the neurologist who figured it out, it was through listening to the story so well. I think really good doctors are really good listeners. And he said, tell me the story of when you got Bell's palsy. And I told the story where the lactation consultant looked at me and said, your eye looks a little droopy. And I made a joke, which was, oh, well, I'm Irish. My eyes sometimes get droopy because like my great uncles, when they get drunk, get really like crescent droopy eyes. And she said, no, look in the mirror. And so I told this story to this doctor and he was like, wait, you're Irish? And I said, yeah. And I was so surprised he flagged that. And he said, I'm going to test you for celiac disease. So celiac is more prevalent for Irish people and it has all kinds of health implications, but one is that you're not absorbing your vitamins. So I wasn't getting enough B12 and B12 is what makes your nerves regrow. So I was so lucky to get the diagnosis because it turned out my daughter has it. And then, and it can cause all kinds of other autoimmune issues, including cancer. And so the kind of final piece that locked into place as I was writing the book, which was so shocking really to me, was my father died of cancer when I was 52, and we never knew he had celiac disease, but it is genetic. And when I was writing the book, I was looking at his baby book and found out that it said baby Patrick Ruhl celiac disease. It was thought of as an autoimmune, or sorry, it wasn't really thought of as an autoimmune thing you have your whole life. It was thought of as a pediatric illness. So he never knew, it was in his baby book, but as a grown-up, he never knew.
Wow.
Huh.
You think that, like, okay, you've got a child, and then celiac disease means a lot of things for kids. It means you can't eat this, you can't eat that. Do you think that you're having this and it made you more sympathetic of understanding what she was going to go through and being able to walk her through and educate her in a positive, like, a view, as opposed to this is a negative? Like, there things are going to happen, but other things are going to be okay.
I hope so. And, the fact that I'd gone through it first, I think was really helpful. Because I know the impulse with celiac is you can feel really deprived. All of your comfort foods, a bagel, a dumpling, pasta, all those lovely things, the bread of life.
I've heard even beer or like breading on chicken or something like that.
Soy sauce. It's kind of gets into all the nitty gritty of every, you become a really specialized little customer. But the good thing is, if you like to cook, it's okay. It's a curable disease. You just do not eat gluten. So I tried to make it fun for Anna when she was little in terms of what I cooked for her. My husband is a genius with that. And he, would make these beautiful lunches for her. But it was hard, when she was little. I remember everyone in class getting a cupcake for her birthday, and people would forget to get her anything, or we'd have to remember to get her own cupcake, or even when she brought her own thing, there was a feeling of not being able to join in with the group. You're not sharing in the communion that is eating.
My older son is allergic to tree nuts.
Yeah.
And we discovered this when he was 3, when he ate a little tiny piece of cookie, and it was
oh my God.
And it became this whole thing, like wherever we go. I mean, and he would be at McDonald's and say, excuse me, I'm allergic to tree nuts. Do you have any tree nut products in these foods? And like wherever we went, he was so accustomed to doing this. But how many times along the way it has snuck in? He ate one restaurant in Canada. He ate there the next night, same food, and got sick and ends up in the hospital. Had a lot of thoughts about national health care after that. But he said it was just really interesting. He says, because you don't know, at any moment, somebody could say, oh, that's not a big deal. We were someplace and they said, oh, there are pecans in the mole sauce. Is that a problem? And we're like, what do you think? Just the being on the plate was the problem?
Yeah. And that's terrifying.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the book, you talk about the lack of care that a lot of medical professionals would kind of make you sit through. And I know Carol has had similar problems. I've had similar problems. I'm sure many of our viewers have had similar problems. So what are things that you found you were able to do to kind of bypass that and get the care that you deserved?
Yes. Issues with getting the health care that you need and deserve. I think for me, it took a really long time even to get a second opinion. I think going back to what you said about self-blame as a patient, first of all, you're not going to get the care you need if you have any degree of self-blame, because you're just going to skulk around and feel bad and feel grateful at any like crumb of care you get. So I think part of it is transforming your sense of agency and thinking that you're deserving of good care. And part of it is luck and talking to people, again, with the feeling like it's invisible and you don't want to talk about it, talking to friends, talking to other people who've had the same condition to get information about where's another place you can try, where's the best place to go, and to not give up and really keep going until you get the care you need.
Was there a lot of time spent in front of the mirror trying to just, to adjust to the new you? It's like, let me go try and smile. Maybe if I try hard enough, it'll work,
Funnily enough, I avoided the mirror instead of sitting there and trying. I was really troubled when I looked at the mirror, so I avoided it. I mean, it wasn't quite as extreme as like putting a towel up over the mirror, but I really would walk past a mirror whenever I could. And when I was eating at a restaurant and there was a mirror facing me, I hated that because I hated how it looked when I ate. So for me, the mirror was a source of great avoidance until I started physical therapy 10 years after the fact, and then sort of had to work with the mirror and learn to look at myself again.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
with Beauty and Symmetry, did you kind of change the way that you reacted to it in the rest of society afterward?
I felt even more aware of how we fetishize symmetry and how problematic that is, particularly in the theater where I work. I was at a book signing recently, and a woman who was an actress in LA had Bell's palsy, but she did camera work. So it just ended her career when she didn't recover. So she moved to Rhode Island and got another career. Why should that be? Why should we so value symmetry that we can't make room? We can't make room for other kinds of expression.
Mm-hmm. I love the line where the photographer was telling you, don't smile with your mouth. You're in this big picture, with that. Okay. Smile with your eyes. And to which you retorted so smartly, I'm not an actress. I have no concept of how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many times they're just sitting there like, could you just do this? And you're like, what are you even talking about? I just absolutely love that. Those moments.
Oh my God. I mean, thank God I'm not an actor. I love them. I love them as avatars, but I'm so glad I'm not an actor.
Yeah, to have to do that.
So there's this point in the book where you talk about how people expect writers to kind of endure their struggle by continuing to write. And you also said that you don't consider that writing is the avenue out of depression, but other people are. So could you expand on that a bit?
I think for a long time, I felt like my writing was sufficient for every predicament, to work my way out of every predicament. And I think when I sort of hit rock bottom after Bell's palsy and celiac and some postpartum depression, I really needed to see another human being and to be in dialogue in a way that you can be in dialogue with yourself while you're writing, but sometimes you can't answer back. You can't be enough of an empathetic mirror to yourself, and you need another human being.
I think that's what a lot of people probably felt over COVID as well.
Mm-hmm.
It was so limiting of what you could do. You could think about all these people that were in nursing homes that were seeing their families only through windows with masks on, trying to communicate, and think about how much we've changed over. Think about Zoom, think about all these things that we never would have been able to do before, but all the other things we were completely limited on doing at the same time.
Yeah.
And what it means, I'm also wondering the effect on young children, because seeing their teachers speaking behind the mask, do you actually, who's lip reading more than you know? Who has a hearing issue at age 3 or 4 that you don't even know about? And we're in these moments right now where there could be these handicaps lurking, but when no one's in the classroom all day long, you have no idea that's what's going on.
Yeah, I think particularly for young children, it's probably, a bit of a nightmare, because so much of education is, relation and connection. And it's very hard to establish that over a screen. I actually felt like, at least for my kids, in a way, it seemed easier that first year where you at least had a connection with your teachers, and then it became Zoom. But starting off a completely new relationship over Zoom, I think, is really, really hard.
Yeah, and it was there were children also that had like ADHD or were very active children, and this was the best for them because they could stand and they could go do this, that, the other thing. And I thought, when you return to the classroom and it's structure, this is how to move. It'd be very interesting to see it's challenges all along the way of what's happening. And we're just looking at one effect of the pandemic. And I think the social implications of this going forward, for being different, for how do you adapt if you're different. Even think about trying to get medical care for what you were going through in the last 18 months, as opposed to where you were before.
Yeah. And an incredible thing is how adaptable human beings are. the resilience of the culture amazes me, as does the, incredible amount of suffering in the last year and a half.
Mhm. Yeah. So there are quite a few techniques and styles in theater that relate to the face and physical impression. And Austin, I know you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, at one point you talk about mask work and you talk about commedia dell'arte. There's mime, there's clown, there's neutral mask. Did you like play with any of these or like test them out because you're in the theater world?
At a point I did, when I was doing physical therapy, I looked up, different modalities for Bell's palsy, and it mentioned mime therapy. And I was like, oh my God, if I'd known there was mime therapy, I would have been like, sign me up, because, I'm a theater person. I never did find mime therapy in the States. But I did.
I hoping you did.
Yeah, we were so excited when we saw it. We thought like, oh, that's such a great thing.
Yeah, like an afterward, maybe, if I do find mime therapy. But I did just try to mirror expressions of actors when I was watching movies. So, I would watch Humphrey Bogart and see what he was doing with his eyebrows and, try to imitate it. Eyebrows give us so much expression. And with Bell's palsy, of course, that's not really going on either, but trying to relearn some of those expressions by watching actors, I definitely did.
There's this thing that comic book artists do where they'll make a face while they're drawing someone else's face.
Really?
Yeah, like if they're like, confused or something, they'll make that face while they're drawing it so that they're like, I've heard it described that they can't think of the face the right way unless they're making it.
That's fascinating. Like what the neurology of that is. Huh.
And I was really wondering if you'd ever done something like that, but I guess not.
No, but you're really good at making an expression. I mean, my kids the other day they're really obsessed with Dan Levy from Schitt's Creek. And so they were looking at a photograph of him. They're like, that's amazing. He can raise one eyebrow and he can make his lip go a little bit down. Like, Mom, could you do that? And I was like, I don't know, but I can try. Bell's palsy gives me some weird opportunities. So.
Which brings me to your son, William, calling your left eye your lizard eye. And it's truly like out of the mouths of babes that some of these things come out. And when you said that, you were trying to figure out what he was talking about. And I think that's just such a great story. He's just sitting there going, well, your little lizard eye. Like,
right.
What are you talking about?
I know, because I told them I was thinking of writing about Bell's palsy, and he was like, oh, you mean your lizard eye? And I was like, my lizard eye? Huh. And I thought, does he think of my left eye as my lizard eye because it's dry, or because it sort of doesn't, the muscles don't move as much? And I realized that he had heard me say little eye because I have something called synkinesis, which is like your muscles do a thing they're not supposed to do when another muscle is working. So if I smile, my eye will close a little bit. So in pictures, I'd be like, oh, look at my little eye, or do something to avoid getting little eye, lizard eye.
Lizard eye. But it was such a boy thing to say. I hate to be sexist, but Mom, you've got that lizard eye thing going on.
Lizard eye.
You can just picture telling his friends, go, my mother's got this lizard eye.
He's got lizard eye. Oh my God. And he's like the sweetest ever.
And that's, I mean, in a lot of your work, it seems there are all these elements or moments where a character will do something that is kind of misunderstood by other people, and their expression doesn't quite get it off right. So like, how do you think that we can bypass that in general? And how were you able to do that?
I mean, misunderstandings are such a good fodder for both comedy and tragedy, right? I mean, part of the human condition is not necessarily knowing what other people are thinking. So wisdom that we acquire over the years hopefully means we learn more and more what other people might be thinking or feeling. And the empathetic imagining into the other is something that obsesses me, as a person who makes theater, as a person who writes, and also as a mother and a friend and a human being. And I think that they've measured a loss of empathy in our culture. They've done some studies. And I wonder if it's not related to having less, actual face-to-face time. to learn that muscle, to train that muscle of empathy. So I hope we all go back to the theater soon. I mean, they're open, but I hope all these places that help train our empathy, including books. I mean, I think I learned a lot of empathy from reading when I was a child.
Mm-hmm. What other people go through that are not your world, and how can you understand it to go forward?
Yeah.
Which leads me to, was there any portion of the book that was tough to write? Like, was when you're sitting there, I just got to walk away from this for a while. This is it's kind of painful.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think my friend Jessica Hecht, who's an actress, has a house in Williamstown, and she lent it to me when I was working on the book. And I think as I was finishing the last section, I flung myself on Jessica's bed and was just, sobbing my eyes out, and then went back and finished it. So I think the end was hard to write. And then I think also actually describing postpartum depression was hard. And my editor, I would be kind of vague about it, like, oh, and then I had that, and I would kind of just skip ahead. And she was like, no, I think you need to actually describe it and try to go there. And that was hard to write, but I was glad I did, because I know so many women who go through it and don't have a way to talk about it and feel ashamed and don't talk to friends or family about it.
You think about how many people who had that when it was not even known as a condition. It was not even.
God.
And you think about so many people that, like, one pregnancy went fine, the second one's not, or vice versa.
Yeah.
They can't figure out like what the difference is. Like, why am I feeling so differently? And it could be sometimes if it's the second child, just because they're two, and it's that's why I'm overwhelmed. And it's really it goes back to, what did we do wrong? Or I can't be like this. And I feel right now with social media with mothers, it is so hard because no child cries on social media.
Right.
Nobody is ever unhappy. No one is ever wearing the wrong shoes. No one does not wearing not shoes. You're never. And there was somebody put up a picture one time and it said, this is the child that was screaming in the hallway for the last 15 minutes. And I was like, oh, how nice. Your child is normal.
Yes, completely. I don't think we have a real window into that. There's a kind of a new expectation of perfection and motherhood. I mean, I think the image of it changes through the centuries. I think we had an image of idealized motherhood in the Victorian era. And I think we had one in the 1950s. And now we have a new one in the 2020s. It changes shape. But there always are these unrealistic expectations. And I think in our culture, just a lack of basic caretaking. Like, I learned that in India, when a woman gives birth for 40 days, her mother or auntie or sister or whatever take care of the child, and you kind of lie in bed and get your bodily strength back and eat special, bone broth and meat that will help you get your blood back. And here it's like, well, if you're a working mom, forget about it. And if your partner, I mean, Tony, my husband, had a week of paternity leave after the twins were born. So there's not a lot of room. There's just not a lot of room in the culture for it.
And, it's also, there's not a lot of room in the culture for everybody not looking perfect. Recently, there's an article in the New York Post that I happen to read in the last 24 hours of all these celebrities who Photoshop themselves. I think it was Madonna being up in Harlem last week, and what she looks like in person compared to the same day where this picture was edited online. And you realize they had pictures of Tom Cruise, they had a number of stars going through, and you were looking at these, and there was such a false idea of what people look like simply because everything's been shopped and fixed. And it was, I don't know, I still found it crazy to look at, even though I'm like used to this.
It's crazy. I mean, it's no wonder there's this generation of girls who are depressed on Instagram, because they're seeing these idealized images. And there's this feature on Zoom. Sorry. There's that feature on Zoom, hide self-view, which I always do because I don't like looking at myself. But I also think I want to write an essay about it, just the title, Hide Self-View. In an age of social media, how are we revealing the self? How are we hiding the self, even as we're performing the self? And this idea that you're supposed to sort of, during the pandemic, always be camera ready. I mean, it's insane making if you're a writer.
Even in your own home, where it's like, it's the pandemic, so I haven't showered today. I haven't like put on real clothes yet, and I have to look brilliant in my pajamas and like say hello to my friends or whatever.
What I'd like to see is a series of photos of also the actual space people are in versus like the little camera ready, Potemkin villages that they're in. Like my sister's a therapist or a psychiatrist, and I remember seeing her little setup where it looked quite neat, for 2 meters or whatever, and then you saw the rest of the house behind.
You should see my apartment now. In order to get set up behind the bookshelf, I had to like move everything to the other side. It's a complete mess.
Yeah, let's just go wide. Everybody just go wide. Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. I worked at Condé Nast for 17 years, right out of college. And for me, it was about the models coming in, and they're like, oh, she's too big to go on the bathing suit shoot. Like they used to bring these girls in the day before. And I think she's not really got the look. And I watched these young models and realized how depressing it's got to be. Her smile's not right, even if you thought it was, and she doesn't smile enough with her eyes. And when I was reading this book, I was thinking a lot about just what we'd hear when these girls came in the door. And they're 17 and 18 years old, off the bus from the plane from Oklahoma, no familial support or whatever. And it was sort of like the version of Instagram back then of what I was just sitting and watching what was going on.
Yeah. Well, it's capitalism too. It's like, how does a capitalist culture treat a woman's face and body as a commodity? And, men too, but I think they have a little more wiggle room.
It's a different thing.
It's a different thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember we'd often sit there and say, I said, why don't we show real people? And they say they really don't want to see them. I was like, but come on, like they're real people.
But we do. That's the thing. We don't think that we do, but we really do. We
don't think we do, but we do. Isn't that interesting? We want the idealized version, and we want the real version.
So this is a bit off topic, I suppose, but we had been talking earlier about things that were tough for you to write. And what I notice a lot is that your prose is really natural and clear, but it also gets you to stop and like consider each sentence. And I'm wondering how you do that. Is that something that you're able to find in a first draft and then like make more precise, or is that something that you keep going back on? And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's so nice of you to say. I love talking about the construction of sentences, partly because talking about this memoir, I find myself talking about medical issues a lot. And what really interests me as a writer is the construction of sentences. But then, of course, you asked me a wonderful question about them, and I have no insight. Like, I don't know. I don't know how how a thought follows a thought is something I love in literature. Watching discoveries get made from sentence to sentence. And maybe it's because I started as a poet, but I'm very interested in exactly what you said. How can a sentence move a story forward, but also how can it make you pause and meditate a little bit? And I think, that some sections have a more fragmented meditative feeling. Maybe that's how I was feeling when I wrote them, but I hope they invite the reader in, so that they can meet those sentences where they live. They can offer their own experiences and kind of be with that language.
And I always think of like book quotes, where you'll see a quote online or you'll see it, at the beginning of another book. And out of context, it's a really beautiful line that you can think about all day, and you can, bring up with friends like, oh, I thought about this and whatever. But if you were reading it in the book, you might totally miss it. And it was just another beautiful part of the story.
Mm-hmm. It's true. And it's a wonderful thing, I think, about literature, that you're both reading for story and propulsion, and you can miss those kind of poetic moments that stop your heart, but you can also read slowly and read for language. And I don't know, I guess that's where prose lives in a way. With poetry, you're reading every line, and with prose, you're reading for some propulsion too. And I think that's why I love switching between genres, because I never get bored. And I feel like I'm less likely to fall into linguistic patterns or, structural patterns in when I make a play. If I write a poem in between, or, work on an essay in between.
The book has chapter titles in it as well. Did you write those as you went along, or did you go back? Because some of them are just terrific. I mean, more than one is really terrific. And I've actually folded down a number of pages of things that I was really interested in. Were those before or later?
I think they came later. I think the structure of the book came later. As I was peeling the onion back, it started to create natural sections. And then I really felt the need for chapter titles.
They're really great. They're really great because sometimes it feels like a sentence. It feels like a complete thought. And sometimes it's just a word like refuge. It's just like, okay, where am I going to go with that? And then there's a chapter that's called Bell's palsy, and it's just called that. And you're like, but the whole book is about that, but you realize it's a reckoning with it is there,
I love a title. I could come up with titles all the live long day. It's so much easier thinking up titles than writing a book.
Which brings me to, was this always the title of the book? A Smile, the Story of a Face? Was that always what the title was?
It was always called Smile. And then I added the story. I kept searching for a subtitle and searching. And part of it is there's a book called Smile that's a children's book, which if you go on Amazon, immediately that will come up. And I thought I need to, somewhat distinguish my book from it.
Raina Tagliafier.
Yes, exactly.
I find it really funny because there was one of your essays was about, I'm trying to remember, something about like you wish that you could just title a bunch of plays untitled and what that would do to them.
Yes, that too. I'm intrigued by that too. I mean, the idea that when you're painting a painting, you can have an untitled painting, but for some reason, when you go to the theater, it would be just, you can't imagine going to an untitled play. I mean, what would that even be? How would you buy a ticket for it? Whereas you could have an untitled poem, but you wouldn't have an untitled book of poems. So I do think that there's something about titling that has to do with the kind of superstructure around the piece of art. But also, I will say when I'm teaching and a student writer can't think of a title, I often think it's because they don't really know what their play is about. Like they don't know the bullseye center of it. And the fact that they can't think of a title means they also haven't quite found the play yet.
It's almost easier to think of it after it's finished and you can, consider it from an outside point of view. But I just love the idea that maybe there could be a day where all of Off-Broadway is just like untitled, and you never know what you're going to get.
That's
theater. It's great.
Yeah, just come. Like, those bookstores that sometimes will wrap brown paper around and say, if you like, murder mysteries, here are 3 books we think you'll like. I love that. I love the surprise in that.
Yeah. And you have to see what people are suggesting to you. Like a lot of times people say, what should I read? Like, well, let's start with, what do you like? And you go and do this kind of forensic thing of trying to figure out to direct them, because if not, I can't just hand you a book. I can't just sit there and you're going to love this. It may have absolutely, and look, we've been doing this for 25 years, and it's very funny because people often say, what should I be reading? And that word should comes up so many times. And I'm like, someone was reading a book last week, and it's a big book right now, and they're saying, I'm not really enjoying this. And I'm like, you can stop. You don't have to love this. You don't have to do this. And it was a complicated book, and someone was giving a recommendation about how to read it, like read these parts and then go back and do different. And it was really interesting to see how so many times people will just sit there and say, I should be doing this. And that was school. And that wasn't even good there.
I agree. And the older I get, the more I'll be likely to finish, a third of a book and then put it away. I mean, as a 20-year-old, I would have doggedly finished, but now I'm kind of like, life is too short. Life might even be too short for Henry James, is sort of how I feel at this point. It's just too long. The sentences are too long. The books are too long. I would rather read what Colm Toibin thinks Henry James was thinking about.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
because it's a slim volume. But
Well, and you talk about the books that you read when you were on bed rest, a Twilight especially, and I was wondering if you could talk about fiction and talk about fantasy and kind of its value.
Yeah, Twilight helped me when I was on bed rest because it's so plot driven, and I was desperate for something that, you know, would get my mind off what I was going through. As a child, I did love some fantasy. I loved Madeline L'Engle and Ray Bradbury. And I guess my plays have been described sometimes as magical realism. And I love, you know, writers like Marquez. I also love really character-driven novels where you're just getting deep inside character. The last novel that I think I just devoured was Pachinko, because I thought it was so deft how she moved from generation to generation, just like quickly sketching character, and you felt like you knew them, and then 30 pages they were gone and you were on to the next generation.
That was absolutely brilliant book. I mean, Min Jinli did just an amazing job of pulling story together and storytelling. And that is a book that took, like, I think 10 years for her to
Is that
write.
right?
It was not. She wrote Free Food for Millionaires, and she's actually working on a third book, but there's not that need of it needs to come out next year. Like, we've got this that has to keep moving along. We need something new. You need to be doing this. And there are a lot of book a year authors right now where I don't think the thought can really come in, especially if you wrote over the last year. There was so much going on, but we're on this wheel of this is what must be performing. And when you see somebody like that's not doing that like that, it's, oh, look at art happens later. Donna Tartt, like, look what happens all this time later.
Or like the woman who wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and which I thought was an incredible book. And it was sort of like, you know, 10 or so years later, the next book came. And I think, you know, I feel that in the theater a lot too, that, you know, there's a kind of, there can be a hamster wheel. And I was hoping that when we came back to the theater, we would have reflected on this pause, on the amount of time it takes to really digest and think through an artistic process. And instead, I'm feeling a real frenzy in the culture of like, let's get it all back on, you know, all at once, let's do it, move it along, you know. So I hope some people take some of that slowness to heart, that we, you know, it was one of the little gifts we had in the midst of all that suffering of the past 2 years.
And you think about it, theater can't just start back up. You have to get everybody rehearsing again. You got to see, and I'm really curious, and I don't have a window on this because I haven't spent a lot of time at the theater, how a show that was before looks now. Does it look exactly the same? Are there any nuances that have been picked up? And I wouldn't be the expert to know that at all, but I think it'd be very interesting to see, for the experience of being away in a starring role, how you come back and drop into that persona. Last weekend, I was even watching, you know, the Bond film was released, and I'm a huge Bond fan. And I was thinking, Daniel Craig is now talking about a film that he made a year and a half ago. And it was supposed to do this, or it was really like 2 years ago. And to put yourself back into that and go do 9,000 interviews and make everything interesting, so rough to be able to do, because you're like restarting yourself. You've done 2 projects in between.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I know Antoinette Nwandu, who's a wonderful writer who had one of the first plays back on Broadway, Passover. She did 3 drafts, you know, one for Lincoln Center, one for the Goodman in Chicago, then Lincoln Center, and one for the Broadway version. And I know she really took into account being post George Floyd and post COVID when she did the draft for Broadway. And I really admire that. I think she's going to publish all 3 drafts and kind of show that part of her process, you know, the evolution of the work changed based on the time she was in.
I love that. That's
So many times it seems like some of the best things we remember about art, whether it's a book or a play or anything, is something that it was in the news while you were writing, or it was something that you just found accidentally in rehearsal while you were screwing around on break or something, like, and those are the things that you always think back on.
accident is a great thing in the theater. And I miss that so much, not having been in a rehearsal room for a long time. Just, what pops into my head is this wonderful actor, Michael Cyril Creighton, who's in that show, Only Murders in the Building now, plays Howard. Anyway, he was my played Stage Kiss. And it's just like, we were doing a fight scene and just pushed someone onto a bed, and I can't describe it. It was the funniest thing. And he sort of tipped over onto the bed, and you had to be there. Not funny describing it, but we just died laughing. And every time we tried to reproduce it, it was less and less funny, every time we tried to find that accidental thing again. But I miss that sensation of being in a room with people making something.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go for it, Carol.
But what we're thinking about is, what was it like narrating the audiobook? Speaking of being a performer on stage, performing your own work, what was that like?
I actually loved it. It was so interesting. It was like doing a deep dive into my life and telling a story from beginning to end. It felt kind of cathartic that it was in my own voice, and I told it in real time. And I recorded it in Evanston, where I'm from. And so it was like this sweet little studio with butterflies and bunnies outside, and a really lovely guy who was listening to the whole thing on headset. And then, of course, there were the challenges, like, which you must be aware of since you do this show, like mouth sounds, like, oh my God, eat a green apple, you're making mouth sounds, or you just, smacked your lips, do it over. And I was like, oh, and now you have to talk and breathe at the same time, so all those acting things, the first 10 minutes or so, I was like, oh my God, how do people talk and act and breathe all at the same time? But once I got going, I really loved it.
I thought it was really good. I listened to the audio because I've been having a problem with mail. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I thought it was better narration than a lot of voice actors sometimes for books. Okay. It's a bit different because it's your own story and not a novelization, but yeah, I found it really, really good.
I need my Grammy. I mean,
yeah.
Well, yeah, that's exactly the audio award. The audio award of what's doing. Do you usually listen to audiobooks? Have you done a lot of listening?
Not a huge amount, partly because living in New York, I don't drive much. And when I take driving trips with the kids, we always listen to audiobooks. Mm-hmm. But in general, I don't.
Also, when you were producing it, were there moments where you wish you could edit a sentence? Because I've had some authors say to me, I can't do my own work, because I would take that whole paragraph out and never read it. Like, I would just never want that to come up, but you have to do exactly what's on the page. Was that a challenge at some points?
At least like 57 times. I was like, can I just take that word out? And they're like, no, has to be. And I just breathe through it and deliver.
It's just like it's do.
Yeah, like you think I should have read this out loud while I was in the editing process, and next time maybe I will.
We're about to wrap up, so I have a really big question for you, if that's all right. In the acknowledgements, you thank your theater family for all the help that they gave you, whether it was for being a writer, being a mother, having a chronic condition. And I've spent a lot of my life in theater, and then outside of theater, like I've been on both sides, and I can say that outside of theater, it's a lot harder to find that kind of family where everybody really cares for each other and kind of works towards something together. And so I'm wondering what advice you have for all of us, whether we're in a crisis or just, getting through COVID or whatever. How do we find and foster that family?
There's nothing like theater family because it's quick, it's intense. You are in an imaginary world together. If you're with the right group of people and the right kind of director, it's instant community. And of course, if you're in the wrong kind of room, it's like instant toxic community, which, luckily has not happened to me much in the course of my life. I've been so lucky to work with some of the same people over time who have a shared sense of artistry, a shared sense of humor. So find those people in your life. And what do they say in Hamlet? Grapple yourself to them with hooks of steel. Does Horatio say that? miss having fun.
Mhm.
I find theater really fun. And I think fun binds people together. And we're also in a workaholic culture. Of course, with theater, you're working really hard and you're having fun, but it's a new obsession of mine, having fun. And I'm a pretty serious-minded individual. So during this time of Zoom, if you can waste some time with others, I would highly recommend it.
Mhm.
Go waste some time with other human beings. You'll see, it's going to be like the best thing you did all day.
Go do something completely mindless. Go do something completely that you don't have to do. And
Yes.
sometimes I'm doing a day and I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to call a friend. I have
Yes.
done all this business stuff and I'm
Yes.
going to allow myself, because I feel like the last year and a half, we haven't been allowed to do anything that wasn't purposeful and moving forward. And there are times where we've done this whole day and I think, you know, I'm just going to go call somebody. And when I
Yep.
talked about nothing to do with books, and I love books, but I just need a little tiny break, you know?
Old friends who have nothing to do with your professional life. That's a good phone call to make, I found.
Yeah. And it's also connecting with some of these people, like, what are you doing with your life right now? Because I haven't seen you in a really long time. Tell me what is going on. And the honest people make it really fun. The honest ones, the ones that I think people got a lot more honest this last year, because there's no fooling around on what's going on. It's
Yeah.
just, and you know, a lot of people, the people who were all into materialism and we have to go here and we have to go there, it's been a lot rougher than those of us who just sat there and said, like, some people in our town, a lot of people go out to dinner a lot. We rarely go out to dinner, we cook. And we went to the food store one time and there was no duck, not that we were buying it, but there was no duck left at the supermarket. And I said to my husband, like, usually there's a lot of duck. And he goes, there was one duck left. And you realize that people just thought, I would go to a restaurant and eat duck. I can make duck. Like, I can do this. And there was no cooking skill at all going on. So it was kind of funny to see these things, these play acting that people were actually doing with their lives over the past year of, this is going to work, you know?
I have never cooked a duck. I'm just putting that out there.
Me neither.
Austin, were you going to say something?
I mean, that's almost one of the ways I think people found that sense of play too. Like, oh, I guess I'm going to learn how to cook now because I can't do anything else. I'm not at work all the time, so I have to do something.
Yeah.
And then everybody miserably failed and still had fun with it. And
but thank God for books over the past 2 years. I mean, books,
yeah,
no germs, no trouble. You know, perfect.
Speaking of which, what's next for you? What are you doing next?
I have an opera coming to the Metropolitan Opera November 23rd. So I go into rehearsals on Monday, which I'm really excited about.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So for something happening on November 23rd, the timeline is that tight for doing an opera?
I mean, we've been working on it for such a long time. We did it at LA Opera first before the pandemic, and it's an old play of mine, Eurydice, that I wrote the libretto for. So the Met has a very long range planning apparatus, but you know, we won't actually be in a room until Monday.
Very interesting. It's always, you think that, oh, everything's happening for months and months, and it's no, very compressed time frame.
Yeah.
Well, we have so appreciated your joining us. I saw you.
Definitely.
I saw you in an early preview talking about this book, and I was just there. I want to have a more conversation with her. And then Austin said, I want to read this book and I want to talk to her. I've read all her plays. So this is fabulous.
Well, that's so cool to have both of you. It's been a total delight.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay.
Well, and to everybody else, look forward to seeing you next time on Book Reporter Talks To. Have a great day.